It's not the quantity, it's the quality of the toms. While we're talking about lost and found, I found a roll of money with a rubber band around it. Anybody lose it? Well, if you did, I found a rubber band. When I was attending college, East Central University in Ada, Oklahoma, I majored in history. And there were two courses that were required. I mean, there was one course that was required in order to, well, there were several courses required, but one of them was either a history of Rome or a history of Greece. And after I had taken the one, I think it was the history of Greece, I went back and signed up for the history of Rome, and my advisor said, you don't need to take the history of Rome because you fulfill that obligation in the history of Greece. And I said, you don't understand. I know I don't have to take it, but I want to take it. And I've made this observation to 2 or 3 people this morning that the Christian looks at history in a different perspective than anybody else does. I would imagine that all those students in that classroom there at East Central University, and even maybe the teacher himself, not being Christians, just cannot appreciate how God unfolded His plans and preparing and blessing and eventually even destroying a number of nations along the way. If you're looking for a detailed account of Roman history in this lesson this morning, you're going to be sorely disappointed because you can't provide a detailed account in 35 or 40 minutes. I don't know that there's any part of history that you can achieve that particular goal. You've heard the phrases made or statements made that if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to what? Repeat history. Now that's been said in a number of ways. Winston Churchill said if we fail to learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. But generally it's the same thought. He was not the original one who made that observation. We're living in a very unique age. Western world is rapidly declining, and I'm speaking to an audience that understands that. Socialism / communism is a failed system of government. It's never worked. It never has worked. And all of the modern day countries that have attempted to apply socialism to their political and social communities has utterly ended up in utter ruin. And yet now we have the millennial and the Generation X. I get lost in these generational designations. But the two most recent now are clamoring, they're calling for communism, Marxism. I read a very frightening survey, been about 6 months ago, that of all those surveyed who are the millennial generation and or the Generation X, 65% say that Marxism, the writings of Marx, are better than the Constitution of the United States. We have failed to learn from history. And when we look at the history of Rome, basically you've got the same thought. We need to learn from the history of Rome and from the other studies that we've engaged in this week, studies about Egypt, about the Canaanites, about Philistia. And there's one lesson that comes out in every one of these, and it is that when a nation opposes God, when they step in the ring to oppose God, they are going to end up losing the battle. There is no exception to that. The psalmist writer tells us in Psalm chapter 2 that God looked at the nation and he presents this question, why do the heathen rage and the nations imagine a vain thing? And then he goes on to describe what he was specifically referring to. They had made a determined choice to cast off the restraints of God. They had climbed into the ring to fight God, and in every case, the psalmist writer puts it like this. He says, God will have them in derision. We would use a common American vernacular or English vernacular by saying God got the last laugh, did he not? Not that it's humorous. And in fact, the psalmist writer even says God laughs at them. It is that their arrogance and their pride and their attempt to overthrow God in their lives and in their society was an utter failure. So this study about Rome is not intended to be a study just for history's sake. There's a lot of historical information I'm going to give you in order to unfold the approach that I want to use in this, which, by the way, I did send in this entire manuscript, and Jason was graceful. Well, maybe he's not the one that handled this. Well, whoever was responsible for either editing or cutting or whatever, I think they put this on the website in its entirety. It's about 20 pages. Don't get scared. We're still going to eat at 11:30, I think. I may go a little bit longer than this, but anyway. I'll try to quit on time. Well, I will quit on time. But this is not intended to be a study of a nation just for the sake of history. It is a study to help us understand that God uses nations to fulfill His purpose. He uses nations to fulfill His purpose. And it's interesting that biblical history, in many instances, I use this terminology, it intersects secular history. The Bible is not really a source book on history. It uses history, just like it uses science and prophecy. But it intersects with secular history on a number of occasions. And we've seen in secular history and even in biblical history the rise and fall of nations. Some of those nations were mighty and powerful. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and probably a dozen of really powerful nations that have come and gone over the years. And then there are insignificant nations that secular writers didn't even write about. The Hittites, for example, for years believed to be an imaginary nation that the Bible writers had inserted into their record. But it is the purpose of this lesson to look at this nation of Rome and see how God used that nation. We're going to do three things in this lesson. Number one, we're going to look at Rome in prophecy. And from the Old Testament standpoint. And again, this will not be a detailed study. I'm presuming or assuming that each one of us in this auditorium has some basis in Old Testament prophecy. And so we're going to just very quickly make reference to that. But we're going to see Rome in prophecy with the view of seeing how God prepares nations. So this first point is going to be Rome in prophecy as God prepares that nation. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to look at Rome just prior to the coming of Christ under the approach of God blesses Rome. In other words, He prepared Rome and then He blesses and He used Rome. And we're going to be particularly interested in what is called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, and how that benefited the spread of the gospel. And then the third thing we're going to do is we're going to look at Rome as the enemy of Christ / the church as an indication of how God destroys nations. And the three things that we're really wanting to focus on is how God prepares nations, how God blesses nations, and how God destroys those nations when they rebel against Him. And you can take this approach with any nation that's come along, that God will prepare that nation, and even in the midst of nations that are in total rebellion against God, evil nations, God will allow those nations to rise, and then He will use them according to His purpose. Not that God is the author of the evil, it is that He uses the wickedness of men to achieve His purpose. But there was something special about Roman history, the nation of Rome, and that is, as you well know, that Rome was the country that was in power, the nation that was in power when the Messiah came. What other nation can brag with that? You talk about bragging rights. What other nation that has ever existed could ever say, we were the nation in power when God sent His Son to die upon the cross, and to send the gospel throughout the entire world. So those are the three things that we're going to look at. Let's talk about God preparing Rome, okay? God preparing Rome. The prediction of the rise and fall of nations, in my estimation, is one of the most fascinating studies in the Old Testament. You're familiar with the book of Daniel. Daniel is replete with references to these great mighty nations that would arise. Daniel 2 particularly has this image that Daniel saw, and you recall that Nebuchadnezzar saw that you had the image with the head of gold. That was Babylon, the world in power at that time. It was the world power. And then King Nebuchadnezzar saw the breast of silver and the belly of brass and the legs of clay, miry clay. And Daniel, by divine prophecy and inspiration, tells us what those four images stand for. You had Babylon, which was the mighty nation at the time that the dream was given and the prophecy was given. And one of the fascinating aspects of this is that when that dream of Nebuchadnezzar was given to Daniel, and Daniel revealed that and said, after you, Nebuchadnezzar, after you, there is going to arise a nation mightier than you. And here's what's really interesting about that. At the time this interpretation, this prophecy was given, there was nothing, absolutely nothing on the horizon that would even indicate that Babylon was going to fall, and yet it would fall, and it didn't take many years after that. And so you have Babylon, and then you have the Medo-Grecian Empire, and that gave way to the Greece Empire, and that eventually gave way to the Roman Empire. But Babylon would fall to the Medes and to the Persians, and the prophecy of Daniel, of course, would come to pass exactly as he had prophesied. Another aspect in this, I'm still dealing with this preparing Rome, is that in order, I think, to appreciate the great role that Rome played, you have to think a little bit about the origin of Rome. I'm looking at how God prepared Rome. Now, a secular historian, he's going to read all the facts that I read, and you know what he's going to see in it? He's going to see circumstance, happenstance. It's all happenstance. It's just the way survival of the fittest. And I haven't taken any courses from secular colleges in a long time, but I get this nagging feeling that in secular courses, they do everything they can to push the Marxist philosophy, the survival of the fittest. But here's the whole history of nations rising and fall refutes that concept. It's not always the mightiest nation that arises. Sometimes it is the weakest nation. Sometimes it's even the most evil nation that arises. So I want to, just very quickly, I want to trace the rise of Rome. And I'm just going to give you just a brief skeletal outline. And I gave a history lesson one time, and it's very similar to this. It was just a brief examination of Alexander the Great, and somebody came to me after the lesson. They said, "You left out so many details." I said, "Well, if you'll give me another 6 weeks, 10 hours a day, we'll go into a lot of detail." So don't expect a lot of detail. If you're here to look for a lot of detail, you may be somewhat disappointed. But let's talk about the development of this nation. As in our mind, we're seeing God involved in the rise of this nation. And when I look at these details, I stand amazed at this. The establishment of Rome occurred several hundred years BC, and basically the area of Rome was a farming community. And there's a legend that came up that said how Rome got started is there was 2 little boys that got lost in the wilderness, Romulus and Remus. And there was a wild animal, a wild bear or something, that took these boys in and raised them. Now that's just legend. But Rome got its name from Romulus. this mythical, legendary creature. But when you look at the historical facts, what happened is the area of Rome, if you in your mind can sort of imagine the boot of Italy coming down, and as the top of that boot curves and attaches to that continent up there, Rome is not too far south of that. But actually there were Indo-European migrants who were looking for trade routes in order to increase their power, increase their financial standing. And so they migrated into that area looking for these trade routes and access to the Mediterranean Sea. And so Rome then, the city of Rome, became an established place. It was a farming community, basically. What the desire of the politicians and the military people were obviously would have been to expand their power. And you see how that plays out in a lot of history. Now, after several decades, several centuries, the first known people to come to power in and around the city of Rome were the Etruscans. The Etruscans were highly influenced by Grecian culture. And they had a lot of good things going for them. They were influenced with regard to their agriculture, their laws, their political systems. But they were a very loosely organized type of people. And so Rome then, the city of Rome, named after Romulus, becomes an established community. And there, as history moves over the next several hundred years, they will eventually emerge as a powerful people. The Etruscans were instrumental in giving us some things. Now watch carefully. I'm trying to mention things that will help me to see how they would have been beneficial to the spread of the gospel. The Etruscans introduced things like the ark. That also came from Grecian culture, by the way. The Etruscans were instrumental in coming up with an alphabet, a numbering system, and their laws helped to shape the government that would carry over into Roman civilization. They were very particular on checks and balances, and we'll mention some of the things in the system of government, but the Etruscan rule would last until about 509 BC. So you're looking at about 6 centuries prior to the actual rise of the Roman Empire and or the Roman Republic. So about 509 BC is when the Etruscans began to fade off the scene and the Roman Republic then begins to emerge. Now, I'm going to make a distinction here between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. They're two vastly different nations. But both of them, of course, focused on that particular city of Rome. The Roman Republic came to power around 509 BC. It would last until about 29 BC. Roman society at that time was primarily still a farming community, an agricultural community. It was a mix of Latin and Etruscan societies. There were a lot of Greek influence. And that was even, Greek influence was even carried over into Roman society. So those particular aspects of history had a strong impact on how Rome would develop and what Rome would be like. Rome's political development paralleled a lot of the Grecian government. You had, for example, a democracy. Now, when I say democracy under the Roman Republic, or even the Etruscan society, it was not what you and I consider a democratic society. All of us go to the polls and vote. We even have people that go to the poll that shouldn't be there and vote. I saw an interesting item. There was a man elected out in where was it? He was elected to office, but he was dead. He applied. He applied, and he was the only one on the ticket, and then he died before the vote. But they elected him anyway. So I guess the dead can vote. The dead can be elected. But they had a sort of a loose democracy, and by that I mean basically it was the aristocratic society, the rich and the wealthy, who decided the laws, and they would vote among themselves. And so you had the lower class that basically did not have those rights, many of whom were slaves or common laborers. We'll talk about how those rose in later years. The Roman Republic had magistrates. They had a senate. There were annual elections among these elective oligarchy, and so it wasn't strictly a democracy. That would later come to the forefront as they adjusted to their needs, and so it's this wealthy aristocrats who composed that Senate. In the early days, these aristocratic families controlled all of society's decisions, including politics, religion, economics, the military, and you had basically two classes. The middle class, the more I study history, the more I think the middle class is the product of the Western world. And when a middle class is strong and families are strong, your nation survives. But this nation that was developing, it was the rich and the poor. You had the rich who were referred to as patricians, and then you had the poor of society, which was the big, vast majority, were referred to as plebeians. They were the common people. And they did not have the power to vote at first, but that would evolve over several hundred years as they're moving toward the Roman Empire. We're still in the Roman Republic at this particular point. The arrangement would evolve in the centuries to the coming of the Roman Empire, but there would begin this internal strife, as it is with all nations. And as nations rise in power and their military might become stronger, they stretch their borders, they begin getting into conflict with others, and so it's inevitable that there would arise difficulties. But one of the advantages in the political structure and in the social structure that would be carried over into the Roman Empire, which in turn would lend itself to the advancement of Christianity when the time came, was the rise of the individual rights of those in the lower class. Those in the lower class. Actually, the Roman Republic became a prototype of the Roman Empire. There was a system of checks and balances. There was a plebeian council. Now remember, the plebes are who? The lower class. But there arose a plebeian council that was established in order to give the plebeians representation in government affairs and in social affairs. The council would oversee the affairs of the common man, would protect their interest, and eventually, watch how all of this is developing, the plebeians gained the right to elect officials known as tribunes, whose job it was to protect against unjust treatment of patricians. Eventually, the plebeian council gained the right to even veto laws that were passed by the patricians. So you see how the power is shifting from one area of the aristocrats down to the common man. And I'm thinking at this point, though I didn't have any specific details, but I was thinking at this point, the common man. What language was the New Testament written in? The common man's Greek. What laws were passed so that the common man was protected? So you see, all of society now is entering into a phase in which the common man would begin to gain rights, and that itself would lend to the spread of the gospel. It was also during this period that a codified law system came into existence, and in fact it became a requirement for these laws to be nailed in public view in the square where people could go by and they could read those laws, and a judge, a magistrate who tried to pass an edict contrary to those laws, the common people immediately knew he was in violation of their rights. And so you begin to see a system that's developing very much akin to the Western world. And this council this eventually led to this plebeian council, which had the interest of the common man, and then eventually a constitution was written. All this under the Roman Republic. We're moving toward the Roman Empire. As this republic began to flex its political and military muscle, it was inevitable that a major conflict would arise, and this came in the form of what we call the Punic Wars. There were 3 of these. The first Punic War occurred about maybe 264. There was violence between Carthage and Rome. Now, Carthage was across the Mediterranean Sea over on the north coast of Africa. And this First Punic War would solidify the power of Rome and eventually lead to the Roman Empire, but it would give the Roman Republic power over the whole of the Mediterranean area. And I can already see in my mind what's happening. You're having the establishment of a single nation that would reach into all the known world and would enhance the spread of the gospel when it eventually came. The First Punic War was fought mostly at sea, and Carthage was victorious in that. Rome didn't have a good naval force, and so Rome was pushed back. And then Rome immediately retaliated in order to go back and to destroy the Carthaginians. The Second Punic War broke out in 218, and that is when Hannibal, you remember in your history, he went up through Italy and he came down from the northern side with 40,000 troops and several dozen elephants. And they came into the northern section of the boot of Italy, and they devastated the Romans, literally devastated them, and almost destroyed that republic. But by the time Hannibal had gained the upper hand, there was a Roman general by the name of Publius Cornelius Scipio. And Scipio immediately retaliated and headed over to Carthage, built a navy and went over to Carthage, and that caused Hannibal to have to withdraw and come back around to Africa to defend what they had in Carthage. And it was during that siege of Carthage that Carthage was subdued and eventually had to sign a treaty with Rome. The Third Punic War was the last of the Punic Wars, and I found this really curious. In the Second Punic War, Carthage had to sign an agreement. You can't wage war without Romans' permission now. Now, likely that meant you couldn't wage war with other countries unless Rome gives you permission. But that wasn't enough for Rome. They're expanding their borders. They're taking control of these nations. And so they sail across to Carthage. The Carthaginians come out and they lay all their arms at the feet of the Romans, and the Romans still destroy Carthage. They siege it, burn it to the ground. And so now what's happening? Rome is developing full control over all of the Mediterranean world. And it would be that way as they enter into the period known as the Roman Empire. So we sort of fast forward a little bit now, and after the Carthaginian Wars, the Punic Wars, and some civil war in the Republic itself began to deteriorate the Roman Republic. They had strife within, had civil unrest. There were attempts to try to correct that, but they were not successful. And so from the Civil War now in the Roman Republic, there arose a type of government known as a triumvirate. There were three men whose names you'll probably recognize who were the primary leaders in the Roman Republic under this triumvirate type government. One of these was Pompeius Magnus, Pompey. The other was Marcus Licinius Crassus. That's the second, and then the third one was Gaius Julius Caesar. Those three ruled over the Roman Republic at this time. And officially, the Roman Republic came to an end about 27 when Julius Caesar had overthrown these other two, and he marched into the city of Rome with all of his power, and he was immediately elected as the dictator of Rome. Other titles that were given to him: he was considered the Principus, the first citizen. He was called the Imperator, the successful general. He was called the Pontifex Maximus, chief religious leader. What's happening? You see, this man is getting sole control over all the Roman Republic. He had the power to call the Senate, veto Senate laws, even make laws himself. And so Rome now moves from being a Roman republic to a Roman empire. But Julius Caesar, He doesn't live very long. He's assassinated very shortly, and eventually that power then rises to others like Mark Antony, Octavian, as they move into this age of the Roman Empire. Now that's God preparing Rome. And I'm going to sort of intertwine this with my second point. I want to look at how God blessed Rome. Once the government was in position, now God begins to mold Rome so that about 40 years later the Christ would come. 60 years later the Christ would come. And in order to appreciate that, I think you have to look at Rome from 2 or 3 different standpoints. I want to look at it, first of all, from the standpoint of Roman society. This was the period known as the Pax Romana. For 200 years, Rome would enjoy absolute peace throughout the empire, the Pax Romana. The mighty nation of Rome enjoyed one of the highest standards of living that the world has ever known, perhaps second only to the Solomonic Empire, some 4 or 5 centuries, several centuries earlier. Prosperity abounded. The wealthy people had property. They had their houses, and some of those houses even had running water. And some of them even had vacation houses. And so they were very wealthy. It was a time of wealth, prosperity, and many of those homes were the envy of the rest of the world. Romans of all classes, enjoyed various forms of entertainment. Chariot races, gladiatorial expositions abounded. The expositions took place in coliseums where you could have 50,000 or more spectators. Talk about a Super Bowl. You know, we have our 70 or 80,000 now, but even back then. The Romans built roads that would reach into all the various aspects of the Roman Empire. It's been estimated that there were more than 250,000 roads that Rome built, extending all the way up into Great Britain. Many of those were paved roads made out of stone and even in some places metal. And they were shaped so as to let the water run off the roads into the ditches. It was a very modern society. And even when you got up into Gaul, which was basically an uninhabited area, a heathen area, no less than 13,000 miles of roads had been laid. And did you know that most of the road system in Italy today is based upon that road system that the Romans built, connecting what cities to what cities? And there are even still, I'm told, I've never been to Italy, but I've been told that there are still some of those paved stone roads still in existence that you can travel over. So you can see the amazing influence that they had. So the society itself was really quite astonishing. Roman law was quite interesting as well. It contributed to the spread of the gospel. Romans were the first people to organize representation with voting blocks, turning out tribes and groups to vote in the same manner as democratic countries vote today. They had a Senate similar to our current Senate that functions much in the same way that we do. They had magisterial decisions, statutes, emperor's edicts, senatorial decrees, assembly votes, and all of that to enforce this codified law and to give people who were Roman citizens rights far beyond most of the people in the world. And Paul appealed to those Roman laws. You remember when he was arrested and he was about to be beaten, he said, "Is it right to beat a Roman citizen?" And you remember what he answered when the guard said, "Well, I bought my citizenship. How did you get yours?" Paul said, "I was Roman born." And so Paul appealed then to Roman law for his protection. When he was arrested, I think one of the most fascinating uses of Roman law on the part of the Apostle Paul was when he appealed to Caesar. He wasn't going to go to Jerusalem and be judged there. He knew he was innocent. He would not get a fair trial in Jerusalem, so he appealed to Caesar. Here's something that I learned in my class on Roman history that I've never forgotten. And it is that when a man appealed to Caesar, nobody could stop him from going. Nobody had that right. But here's another interesting feature of that if you appealed to Caesar and you got to Caesar and you were convicted, shown to be guilty of whatever crime you appealed for, doesn't make any difference. If you were found guilty, it was the automatic death sentence. He appealed to Caesar thinking he was right, knowing he was right. And so he used those laws in order to accomplish the great things that he did. Roman peace is another aspect of the Roman society. Yes, it had its wars, but we sometimes talk about the Pax Romana. Pax Romana was an extended peace for 200 years, unlike any period of peace in the history of the world other than what the Western world has produced. But it was not really the kind of peace that we enjoy. It was a forced peace. But the citizens of Rome could enjoy that peace while Rome was determined to destroy its enemies and went forth to battle those enemies. And so it was a peace that was beneficial. And then there was also the laws themselves that protected Roman citizens. And so this 200-year period of what we call the Pax Romana. And what I see as I look at God and the spread of the gospel is that during this period of peace, God was preparing Rome for the spread of the gospel. Roads to travel, a common language, laws that would protect them. And so the gospel would go forth. Let's talk about Rome destroyed very quickly, and then we'll have just a couple of lessons. Third stage in the history of Rome is typical of so many mighty nations. You've heard what historian Edward Gibbon has said about the 5 causes of the fall of Rome. Rapid increase of divorce, higher and higher taxes. You know, every time I read this, Tom, I can see just a carbon copy of what's happening in our society. It has been for the last 50 years. Higher taxes and the spending of public money on bread and circuses. Number 3, the mad craze for pleasure. Sports becoming every year more brutal and exciting. Number 4, the building of gigantic armies to fight external enemies, but the real enemy was who? Is what was inside, the decadence of the moral decay of the people. And then number 5, the decay of religion, faith fading into mere form and losing touch with life and becoming impotent to guide it. So the rejection of God enhanced the collapse of that nation. But there was a second aspect that really thrust Rome into the crosshairs of Almighty God, and that is the persecution of the Christians. And time doesn't allow me to tell you about all those persecutions. If you want a really interesting book, read Fox's Book of Martyrs on the persecution of Christianity. And it will shock you some of the things that they had to engage in, had to endure. But when Rome turned its attention toward Christ and toward the church and the persecution of the church, essentially the church became public enemy number 1 to the Roman Empire. And over the next 400 or 500 years, until Constantine comes to power, there would be this persecution of the church. And some of those things are astonishing. We may face the same kind of persecution in the very near future as things continue to unfold, and not in a favorable way toward those who claim to follow Christ. So you had God preparing Rome, then you had God blessing Rome, and then you had God destroying Rome. And when Rome turned their back upon God and started persecuting Christians, the fall was rapid and swift, and it would eventually go into complete oblivion. Let me just give you 2 or 3 lessons very quickly. One is that prophecy made and fulfilled is one of the strongest arguments for the inspiration of the Bible. And I can see that in the history of Rome and other nations as well. What did Isaiah say? God, through Isaiah, said, produce your cause. You call forth evidence that you, in fact, are inspired, he says, to the false prophets. So prophecy made and fulfilled is an amazing evidence for inspiration. Here's a second lesson. God always keeps his promises. He had said in times of old that the nation that rejects God will end up in Sheol. The nation that turns its back on God has no hope for a future, none whatsoever. America's no different. It's not a matter of if America is going to fall. It is now a matter of when. And I'm thankful for God's long suffering and his patience. But the day is coming when he will render judgment even upon this nation. He always keeps his promise. Here's one lesson that I must get in. America, this is lesson number 3. America has climbed into the ring to fight God. It's obvious. It can't be any clearer than the nose on the front of your face. I want to share with you an incident that occurred about 12 years ago. It was the 2004 Democratic Convention. And it was September the 4th, 2008, first day of the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I want you to listen carefully to what this person writes about that occurrence. In drafting the original platform, Democratic leaders had removed references to God and to Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They didn't merely forget to mention God. In updating previous party platforms, they made a conscious decision to remove him. When that decision was brought to the attention of ordinary American voters outside the orbit of the Democratic Party, it was unpopular. It didn't play well in Peoria. Belatedly, the Democratic leaders realized that they should put God back into the picture. And so an amendment to the platform was placed on the convention's agenda. And here's where things got interesting. That amendment was controversial. Quite a few delegates opposed the mention of God. Some, no doubt, were primarily concerned about the mention of Jerusalem. Party leaders might have simplified matters by introducing 2 separate amendments, one to restore the mention of God and the other the name of Jerusalem. But that tactic would not have suited the purposes of the party strategists. They didn't want an open debate on God during the convention. They didn't want to give American voters the opportunity to see just how radical the Democratic Party had become. They wanted the amendment approved quickly. The article went on to point out that Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa quickly called for a floor vote on whether to put God back into the party platform. Numerous recordings of the delegates' verbal vote revealed that at least half, and perhaps more than half, voted to keep God out. And when Villaraigosa lowered the gavel and declared that it was decided by verbal vote that God would be put back into the platform, the audience booed. I want you to think long and hard about what happened at that convention in 2008. 15 years have since passed. And you know what the Democratic Party, how radical it has become. I stand amazed, brethren, and we need to learn this truth. God is going to use America for his purpose. But I would hate to stand before God on the judgment day, having been in a position of influence, to allow people like that to get into positions of power. Think long and hard about that. And so I see Rome that was prepared by God, Rome that was blessed by God, and then Rome that was destroyed by God. So much so that a lot of the remnants of that Roman Empire have long since passed into history. It will not be long ere this country marches down that same path. And perhaps historians 500 years from now will look back upon America and they will ask the question, what happened? May God help us to appreciate history and to learn from it. Thank you.